Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So let's get started with the previous video in which we were discussing about mandibular fractures classification. So this is the last video on the classification of mandibular fracture. So in this video, I'll be starting with the Kruger's classification of mandibular fracture. So what is Kruger's classification of the mandibular fracture says? So according to this classification, there are subheadings under this classification. So we'll be discussing one by one each of them. So the number one is simple or closed type of fracture. So what is simple or closed type of fracture? So see, by the name it says that this type of fracture is simple. Okay, that means any fracture or basically the linear fracture which does not communicates or which does not have any communication with the exterior or the interior environment, that is termed as simple or closed fracture. Now, in order to understand this, if I draw a figure like this of a mandibular bone. So this is the coronoid process and this is the condyle. So if I show you a simple fracture in this figure, for example, if I draw a fracture line like this and this is the condyle which has been fractured. So this is a type of simple fracture. Okay, it does not have any communication with the outside environment, and it will not be having any communication with the internal environment. Okay, it's just a simple fracture. So the condyle is just being fractured. Okay, so let me write down here under the example. So simple or the closed fracture consist of fractures in the region of condyle, or we can say coronoid process. Okay, so these type of fractures are the simple or the closed type of fracture. Coming up with the second subheading, that is your compound or the open fracture. Now, what is compound or open fracture? So, see, this is the closed fracture. Closed means it does not have any communication, but this is the open fracture. That means this type of fracture has communication with the external environment through the skin and with the internal environment through the mucosa of the periodontal membrane. Now, in order to understand this line, if I show you the fracture of the dentate segment, like okay, and these are the central incisors, lateral incisors, canine, premolars, molars. Okay, rest I'm not drawing. Now, if the fracture occurs somewhat like this, okay, like this, okay, then this type of fracture is a compound or open fracture. Now, why this type of fracture is a compound or open fracture? Because if I zoom it out, this particular part, then you can see that in this fracture, this particular teeth, supposedly if it is a first premolar, and if this adjacent molar, okay, the fracture line is going somewhat like this, huh? Now, this would have been the roots of the molars, and this is the root of the premolar. So, this fracture line communicates with the perial fibers or the periodontal membrane around the teeth. That communication is the internal communication, and this fracture also communicates with the outside environment via the gingiva or the skin. Okay, so these two communication, the communication interiorly with the periodontal membrane and the communication with the external environment through the skin or through the gingiva that covers the teeth here. Okay, so this type of classification or basically this type of fracture. So this type of fracture that I had explained is termed as open fracture because it is having communications. Okay, so under this, the example that comes is fracture of dentate segments of the jaw. Okay, that means all these segments bearing teeth. Okay, so इस reason का अगर fracture होता है, then that comes under compound or the open type of fracture. So I hope till now it is clear that what is simple and what is compound. Coming up with this third type of subheading under the Kruger's classification, that is your comminuted fracture. So the comminuted term itself means that something is communicate having small communications. Like for example, this type of fracture is a fracture in which the bone is crushed into multiple pieces. So in order to understand the C point, you can just imagine a car windshield or a mirror which has been fractured. Sometimes you have seen that a mirror is fractured or the accidents happen on the roadside. So the part of the windshield is fractured in such a way that there are so multiple pieces of the glass that you can see. Okay, the windshield is fractured in such a way. Okay, so that type of fracture is called as comminuted fracture. If that type of fracture occurs in a bone, then it comes under comminuted fracture. So coming up with the fourth part, that is your green stick fracture. Okay, now what is green stick fracture? So a fracture in which one cortex is involved while the other cortex is bent. Um so in order to understand this, you know that if I write here, bone of a child are resilient and elastic. They are not so stiff, they are not so matured. Okay, the bone of a child. So because of this resiliency, this elasticity gives bone a particular degree of resiliency. Okay, because of which the bone doesn't fracture but it bends. Okay, the bone bends. Now why this happens? Okay, so if I show you, if I draw a picture of a bone here, somewhat like this. Okay, and we know that there is a bone marrow inside a bone, which is a hollow canal like this. Okay, so a bone has two parts. The outer part is the outer cortex, and the inner part is your inner cortex of the bone. Okay, sorry for the handwriting. Fracture line involves only the outer cortex and it is not involving the inner cortex, because of which the bone will somehow show the bending. Okay, it will bend like this. Okay, it will be fractured, not fractured here, but just bent. So this type of fracture is known as green stick fracture. Okay, so why this happens, that why only the outer cortex is involved and not the inner cortex, that I had told you, that is just because in the children's the bone are kind of resilient or basically elastic, and this elasticity provides the bone a degree of resiliency, because of which there is incomplete type of fracture and the bone does not fracture completely but it just bends. So this type of fracture are termed as green streak fracture. I hope it is clear. So moving on ahead with the fifth part, that is your impacted fracture. So what is impacted fracture? By the term impacted, we get to know that impacted means that something is kind of restricted. Okay, so uh, because of the direction and the magnitude of the force during injury, whenever an injury occurs that will lead to eventually fracture, So there is some degree or magnitude of the force which will cause the injury. So the direction, the magnitude of the force is such that two bony fractured segments, in spite of fracture, they are more likely driven into each other. Okay, I mean, the two bones will fracture, but they are kind of merged into each other. So that is termed, because of that thing, this fracture is known as impacted fracture. And this type of fracture are mostly, not I will say always, but they mostly involve the maxilla. Okay, maxilla bone. So more commonly seen in maxilla, in the middle third area of the face. Okay, so now with the F part under the Kruger's classification is the pathological fracture. So, as the term suggests, pathology, some sort of disease would be there. So, because of that, fracture is occurring. So, I had already written these are the fracture that occur as a result of any disease, okay, which weakens the bone to the extent that even a mild injury or the normal functional stimulus leads to a fracture. Okay, so the bone is being weakened so much because of the disease that even the normal function is not carried out by that bone, and that will lead eventually to the fracture. So there are certain diseases under this that I can write here. There are certain generalized skeletal diseases, and there are certain localized skeletal diseases that cause the weakening of the bone. So generalized skeletal disease, for example, endocrine disorders like hyperparathyroidism, or in women's we had most of the time seen postmenopausal uh, osteoporosis. Okay, now under localized disease there are so many disease like, for example, orontomas, cyst, and in case of osteoradionecrosis, most commonly. Okay, so these are the diseases that weakens the bone, and because of the weakening, that bone eventually fracture. So with this, I'll finishing the third classification, that is your Kruger's classification. I hope everything under this classification is very well clear. Now coming up with the last classification, there are many more classification under the mandibular fracture, but I had covered only the most important four classifications. So the last one is the classification which was given by Spiesel. Uh, so this classification is based on five important aspects. So number one is your number of the fragments, then the location of the fracture, where basically the site or the origin, then the status of the occlusion, मतलब fracture के बाद occlusion कैसा होगा, then the soft tissue involvement, whether the surrounding soft tissue is being involved or not, then the associated fracture of the facial skeletal. That means if the fracture, we are studying the fracture of the mandibular bone. So with the mandibular bone, if the fracture of any other facial bone occurs, and that involves the associated fracture of the skeletal. Okay, so in order to learn this classification which was given by Spatial, we can make a mnemonic which is most often like F, L, O, S, and A. So this is comprising Flosa. Okay, I have already told you that F stands for the number of the fragments. So under this, we have divided it like it is divided as F0, F1, F2, F3, F4. See, you need to learn this, okay? You cannot do anything other than that, but you need to memorize this, but it is very easy. Okay, it's not that much tough. So number of fragments, like कितने fragments हो रहे हैं fracture के बाद, ठीक है? So F0 मतलब incomplete fracture, like completely fracture नहीं हुआ है, तो दो particular parts separate ही नहीं हुए हैं, ठीक है? So F1 is the single fracture, okay? F2 is the multiple fracture, and F3 is the comminuted fracture. F4 is the fracture with the bone loss. Okay. Now 2, that was L. So in order to understand this classification of site or location, I had already made a video That was the video number part 1, in which I had discussed the Dinbanks and Natwick's classification. So if you had seen that video, you will very well easily understand this particular subtype under the facial classification. So it is nothing but the L1 is precanine region. So precanine region is nothing but the parasymphysis or the symphysial region. Then the canine region. Then post canine means the region after the canine. Okay, is L3 if the fracture occurs. Then the fracture if occurs at the angle region, it comes under the L4. If supraangular and L5, supraangular basically the ramus part. Then L6 comprises the condylar, and then L7 is the coronoid, and then L8 is the alveolar process, or basically the dentate part. Now coming on to the O part, that is the occlusion. Okay, so after the classification, if there is no malocclusion, okay, that means the if you close the mouth, then there is proper occlusion. Then that is comes under O0, no malocclusion. Then if there is malocclusion, then it comes under O1. Okay. Then if non-existent occlusion. So what is non-existent occlusion? Like if a fracture occurs in a patient who is having no teeth. Okay. So you cannot check occlusion there. That means edentulous mandible hai. Okay. So that comes under non-existent occlusions, and that is O2. Then comes S, soft tissue involvement. So, soft tissue involvement is the same if the fracture occurs and it has some communication with the outer or the internal environment, okay, then that will be the involvement of the soft tissue. So, okay, if it is not having any communication, then it will simply come under S0, that is your closed. If it is open intraorally, then S1. If it is open extraorally, then it is S2. And if it is open both intra and as extra, then that is S3. And if it is a soft tissue defect, then it is S4. That means that was the just communication, but in the fourth part, the soft tissue, some certain major soft tissue is also being trapped in the fracture line or the fracture. Okay. So the last part in the Flosa was the A, that is associated fracture. Okay. So associated fracture, as I had already told, we are studying about the mandibular bone fracture. Okay. So if apart from this bone, any other fracture is also occurring in the facial skeleton, then that is the associated fracture. If it is not occurring, then A0, none. If there is a fracture and or loss of the tooth, then it is A1. If there is a fracture of the nasal bone, then it is A2. If zygoma is also fractured, then A3. And then A4, A5, and A6 comprises of leaf port 1, 2, 3. So now you'll be talking about what is leaf port 1, 2, and 3. See, these are very important fracture lines. Okay. But these comes under a fracture of the maxilla bone. Okay, I'll be making a separate video on each of these leaf port 1, 2, and 3 line. So you'll be easily understanding these line under those videos. Okay. So this with this I'll be ending with the classification part of the mandibular fracture. So I hope each and every classification is very thorough with you. So in my upcoming video, I'll be starting with the clinical features of the mandibular fracture and the treatment part.